Hey there, everyone. Welcome to the Real Life Practice Podcast. I'm Teresa McCloy.
And I'm Lindsay Sturkey, and we are excited to welcome you into our conversation about what it means to practice our faith in our ordinary, everyday life. In each season of the podcast, we explore a different spiritual practice together that will help us connect with God and become more of who He has created us to be.
We love talking about spiritual growth, exploring our life story, and discovering how to pay attention to the moments of our days. And on this season, we are actually looking at the practice of slowing and how it helps us to be present to ourselves and to God. And so we're going to dive in today, Lindsay, with looking at something and someone very specific. We were talking, offline about how we wanted to take this series, and we were talking about, well, it might be important to actually look at an example of someone who lived his life in a posture of slowing. And so today we're actually going to look at Jesus and look to him to say, Jesus, how did you do this? And where do we see that show up in scripture? Because sometimes this idea of slowing, be like, does anybody really live this way and function? And yes, Jesus did. So let's dive in.
For me, when I look at the life of Jesus, it kind of takes away all my excuses that slowness is not available to me, right?
Yeah.
Because when I think about the life of Jesus, who he was, his calling, literally the weight of the world on his shoulders, everyone needing him, coming to him, wanting things from him. And yet he still managed to have a posture of slowness in a way that made him so present to people. And I think that's the
Mhm.
thing that strikes me the most is that Jesus had time to be present with people. And when we think about why is the practice of slowing important, there are so many things we could talk about. But when I think about the life of Jesus, it was so much about taking that posture of how can I be most present and loving towards people?
Mhm. I agree. When I think about uh, what would I want someone to say about me, whether that be at my funeral or something I was being honored at, it would be that I was present and had a presence of not being in a hurry. Very hard with how my personality is wired because I do sense to see time in the future. And yet, when I look at the life of Jesus, he saw time in the present. And, you know, uh, the phrase that I often use and say at the end of every podcast on our sister podcast that every ordinary day has an extraordinary moment. That is my way of inviting myself every day to slow, to practice slowing as Jesus did, as we see in scripture that so many times his relationship, his conversation, his engagement that we read about so much in the Gospels was even as you read the words, it just feels like, gosh, he was so present. Not slow as in he doesn't move fast, although that could be the case, but he was just present in a way that did not feel rushed. Um, and we talk about this a lot in all of the content that we have at the process is living from it's an internal rested place, not an external place. I want to say too, I think we could probably use the excuse of, well, in Jesus' time, you know, everybody walked everywhere, everybody was slow. Like it wasn't, I don't think that's true. I think as humans, they had, I don't care how far back you go in history, same temptations, same expectations, same temptations, all of those things were still going on inside of people. And yet they saw something and felt something very different in Jesus.
Yeah, I think when you said that, what comes to mind for me, that internal place of slowing, what pulls us out of that is often distractions, things that
Hmm.
pull us into other things. And today it's our smartphone. But I remembered seeing some meme or something where it was showing today everyone sitting on a train or a subway with their smartphones. Well, maybe 50 years ago, everybody had their newspaper in front of them.
Yes.
So
Yes.
there's always something that is pulling our attention away from what really matters. And so it's that internal paying attention of, okay, what's most important here? And Jesus chose people time and time again. But even when he had a lot going on, even when there was a lot of people around, he still, from the inside out, slowed down and wasn't on a hurry to the next thing. There's so many examples in scripture of Jesus on the way to somewhere and someone approaches him with a need and he takes the time to turn and to meet them and to look them in the eye and to see exactly what they need. Did he do that with everyone? No. But I love how later in scripture it says that Jesus did the work that God had put him on earth to do.
Yes.
He had so many things that he could have done, but at the end of his life, he said, God, I have done the work that you put me here to do. And so, what does that look like for us to move slowly and be present, but still do what is ours to do? Like, how do we keep moving and take action, but have an internal posture of slowing?
Hmm. And I think that's a lot of discernment, another practice, constantly being in that place. And we see that with Jesus in scripture. So much of his slowing was to go away, to go away to pray, to go to the mountain, to go to the garden, to go to wherever. So it was that in with people, out with, away from people. Um, so many stories throughout scripture. And I would just invite, if you're listening in, and you think about the gospel stories, like what's the one that you notice, or what is the slowing posture? One for me, and it's because it's one of my favorite things to do, is to linger around a table with a meal. So either a meal or a good cup of coffee, or usually involves food or coffee, but the long lingering conversations around a table. And I see that in scripture. I see Jesus gathering around food in some way, shape, or form. And there's something that's very natural that slows us down. Now, in our culture, you can drive through, get it, eat it in your car. We are a fast food culture. But what if the invitation to slowing for you was to say, I'm going to eat in a slow way. I'm going to be present, whether that's getting my family around the table, because conversation happens. And in scripture, we see Jesus having some really deep, I mean, the Lord's Supper, like we see some really deep conversations that happened when you slow down, sit down, gather, have a meal together. So that's one that always stands out for me in scripture. But for you listening in, I don't know what it is for you, Lindsay, but for our listeners, like when you read through a gospel story, what is drawing you in to an area that you could slow, that you see Jesus slow?
I love that example, Teresa, because that's a very practical thing that we can do is where the spaces in my week that I could slow down and sit at a table, either with my family, a friend, invite others in, whatever that looks like, to have that conversation around the table. And for me, when I read scripture, what I notice the most, especially right now in my season of life, is how interruptible Jesus was,
Mm,
that he was never too busy to be interrupted. Even when he was on the way to heal someone or, care for the sick or whatever his journey was taking him on, someone would come with another need. And he didn't say, sorry, I'm too busy doing God's work. You're going to have to take care of yourself. He turned towards them, he saw them, he looked them in the eye, like we said earlier, and he had time for them. And so for me, as especially I think of this with my kids, am I
sure.
interruptible with my kids? And this week is a perfect example of we had snow days and my kids were at home, but I also had work to do. And so again, it's that discernment of what does it look like to do the work that is mine to do, but to slow down long enough to be interruptible and notice the opportunities that come that were not planned for. And
Yeah.
that's just one example that can show up in many ways in our lives when we're going to the store or we're, running errands and there's someone that we can either choose to have a conversation with or kind of plow ahead and do what we need to do. And again, it's discernment. It's not that we can stop and talk to every single person, but are we paying attention and noticing when God is kind of saying in our hearts, this is a time to pause. This is a time to
Yeah.
look someone in the eye and to listen.
It's interesting as you share that story, and most of you know, if you watch us on YouTube, you can see very distinctly Lindsay and I are in two different seasons of life, 40s and 60s. And so, when I hear you, Lindsay, share of your kids interrupting you, I remember those days. And yet now I'm in a season, and some of you listening may be more closer to my season of life and go, when my grandson interrupts me, it's like the blessing. Like, oh, I'll drop everything and I'm a different presence. But I will say this. Many times when you move into the empty nest, or I call the open nest season, we see interruptions as um, you interrupted my time. Like I'm reading my book, I'm watching my television show, I don't want to give up my time. And we become very closed in because it becomes a season, if we're not careful, that's about us.
Mm.
And so, even as you're sharing how Jesus, and it can feel very slow and sometimes very lonely if we're not careful in the second half of life seasons. And yet, how do we stay open in a way of slowness to play with our grandchildren, to be open to conversations we wouldn't have had time to have with people in the season of life that you're in? You know, it's just the difference of noticing, what does slowing mean for me in this season? Doesn't mean necessarily doing less. We don't see Jesus doing less, but as you said, and so true, he did the work that God had for him to do, and he named that. He literally says that. Um, that is so encouraging to me. Of I don't have to live from rush, because what does God have for me today
Mm.
if I slow down enough to notice and be present? I know snow days are awful, but yet I know you remind yourself often of, like, okay, this is a time that I have to be with the girls in a different way. And it's sometimes a very frustrating way. But you know what can we be present to today? And how can I slow myself down? And my season might be, how can I open up a little bit more and notice what God is giving me? So Jesus modeled both of those ways.
And I love the question of what does slowing look like today?
Hmm.
Because, we talk a lot about planning and schedules and all of that, and that's important too. But I know for me, so often I have to take the day that's in front of me, especially
Oh,
when plans change and things don't
yes.
go the way that I had scheduled them. And so,
Yes.
what does slowing look like for me today? It's so often an in the moment, day by day practice of, again, paying attention and noticing where is God at
Hmm.
work around me and what might I miss if I am in such a hurry to get to the next thing? What does it look
Hmm.
like to slow down and really see, especially the people around me?
Yeah. And we use the word schedule, um, and we're calendar people and all of that thing. That's our culture. But I wonder, did Jesus have a schedule, an agenda, uh, a place that he needed to be that day? Um, I would say we probably are always overscheduled,
Mm.
and slowing comes when there's a little bit more margin and open space on our calendars. Um, I laugh all the time with my husband, who farms full time, never done anything else. And I will often say in the morning, "What are you going to do today?" And he'll say, "Don't know. Haven't been to the barn yet." And that phrase just always, because he'll have three or four things that might be possibilities, but he's open to whatever he encounters when he shows up for the day. but not in a way like many of us are of, oh, there's another fire to put out, but more like, I don't know what I'm being invited to yet to tend and to care for. The weather plays a factor, the livestock, all of those things. And it's just always a reminder for me because I'm totally the opposite. He'll go, but I bet you've got a full day, you know, hour by hour, call by call, whatever. And I'm always like, it just reminds me, do I have enough space
Mm.
to be present to whatever I encounter um, in the day? And I think Jesus really shows us that in scripture.
Yeah.
There was a plan, there was a journey, there was a
Mhm.
walk, there was a place, but what am I going to encounter today?
Yeah. So we just encourage you, even as you are reading scripture this week, if you find yourself in the Gospels, notice what this looked like for
Hmm.
Jesus. Notice his posture, his presence, his pace. Notice all of these things and imagine what that might have felt like for him, knowing the pressure he faced, all the things that God had called him to do, the life that he lived, the ministry that he had, the people that needed him. And yet he still had the presence and the inner
Hmm.
slowness that allowed him to be present with people. And so just to pay attention, where do you notice that in scripture as you're
Mm.
reading?
And Lindsay, you brought it up. And I love this. Dallas Willard was asked, what's one way that you would describe Jesus? And the word he used was relaxed.
Yes. Yes.
And yeah.
And I wonder how many of us would have responded with that word. How do you experience Jesus? Because, and again, I think that's why it's important as you're reading scripture to notice this because you may not imagine Jesus as being relaxed with you. You might
Hmm.
imagine him having expectations and demands, whatever that image is that you have of Jesus. What would it feel like to experience Jesus as relaxed with you?
Yes. Yeah. Well, we hope this gives you an invitation to look at scripture and look at the life of Christ and engage in that way. We do have a free resource as we do with every one of the practices that we look at. And you can get that free resource. Lindsay, what's the reference for that one?
So you can find it in the show notes. And the reference is the reallifeprocess.com forward slash slowing.
Okay. Reallifeprocess.com/slowing for that resource. And also, we want to remind you that one of the tools, we have lots of tools here at the Real Life Process, but one of the tools that we have is One Life Maps, our digital maps. We have just taken those to a digital product in the beginning of this year here in 2026. And you can go to onelifemaps.com and check out those resources. That in itself is a tool that might invite you to slowing. And now you don't have to wait for them to arrive in the mail. You could actually engage with them right away, get the digital download either personally or professionally. So check that out at onelifemaps.com.
Well, thank you for joining us for this episode. And as a reminder, we are on every other week. And on alternate Wednesdays, you can check out our sister podcast, Real Life Conversations for Christian Coaches with Teresa and Erica. And so make sure that you are subscribed to both so that you don't miss an episode. So we hope that you will join us next time as we continue to listen to Jesus' invitation to learn the unforced rhythms of grace in our everyday, ordinary life. We'll see you next time.